Catholic Vulgate Bible has 46 books, not 39. So Luther discovered that Jews have 7 fewer books than Catholics have. The reason why goes all the way back to Jesus' time. A lot of Jews, before Jesus was born, had already moved outside Palestine. Some were living in Mesopotamia, some were living in Egypt, some were living in present-day Turkey. A lot of Jews who were living in Egypt wanted to have a translation of the Bible into Greek, because Egypt was controlled by Greeks at that time, and Greek was the official language of Egypt. So the king of Egypt commissioned to have a translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, and that became known as the Septuagint. This was about 200 BC. The books were probably translated over several decades. We roughly say 200 BC at the time of the translation. And of course, things were in scrolls back then and not books, so you couldn't go buy a Septuagint as a single volume. You had to buy a set of scrolls. So the number of scrolls that were included in each single person's copy of the Septuagint varied from some other person's number. Nevertheless, by Jesus' day, or soon thereafter, the number of books in the Septuagint customarily included about 46 books. Well, the Christian writers of the New Testament, people like Matthew, people like Paul, so on, they used the Septuagint when they wrote their books. We can tell because we can look at who they're quoting in their letters and so on, Gospels. For the most part, they used the Septuagint. This irritated the Jews. So about 100 AD, the Jews decided we should determine once and for all what is in the Scriptures and what isn't. So they had a council. It was a meeting of all the major rabbis of the day. It occurred in a town called Jalnia, so it's called the Council of Jalnia. And at this Council of Jalnia in 100 AD, the rabbis sat around and discussed what should they include among all the Jewish writings in the Bible and what should they not. Suffice it to say, they wound up with 39 books, 7 fewer than the Jews living outside Palestine were using. Well, the early Christians didn't switch to 39 just because the Jews have now decided that there should be 39. They continued to use 46, just like the Jews outside Palestine. And all throughout the Middle Ages, when the Bible was translated into Latin, in the Vulgate translation, about 400 AD, it had 46 books. So all Christians everywhere had 46 books minimum in their Old Testament until Luther. And then Luther, seeing that the Jews only had 39, presumably said to himself, should I do 39 books or should I do 46? Well, who wrote the Old Testament anyway? The Jews did. If anybody ought to know what's in the Old Testament, it ought to be the Jews. Therefore, I'm going to go with 39. So he opted to only do the 39. He did go ahead and include the other 7, but he put them as an appendix at the end of the Old Testament. So his Bible had a 39-book Old Testament, a 7-book section, which he referred to as the Apocrypha, which is a term that means secret or private. He said these are okay to read in private, but don't use them in public worship. And then the New Testament. So ever since then, Protestant Bibles normally have only the 39 books. They may include the other 7. If so, they're in an appendix called the Apocrypha. Whereas Catholic Bibles continue to have the 7 sprinkled in amongst the other 39. So that's how that happened.
My son ran into that. He went through from 2nd to 8th grade to Grace Presbyterian School. And of course, they had Bible classes, and they were missing the books. He had many discussions with them. Why were the other books missing?
Right.
Should have been in there. So he really enjoyed comparing the two and bringing discussions about the Bible in class.
That's good. Yeah.
And so he's been a real student of the Bible. He's respected us
It's interesting you mentioned the Presbyterians because even after Luther's decision to exclude those 7 as Scripture, all Protestant Bibles still included those 7. without fail until 1828. For the very first time, the Presbyterian Church decided to print a Bible without books. And from 1828 onward, it became customary for Protestant Bibles not to even include the seven. And then starting around the turn of the century, 1900, they started gradually re-including them, so that now a lot of Protestant Bibles include the Apocrypha, although not as scripture, of course. Which of the two books do you not have? Wisdom and Sirach, the last two, are not considered inspired scripture by Protestants, but they are by Catholics and Greek Orthodox. In addition, for those of you who are curious, the other books that are not included in Protestant Bibles, among the historical books, you have Tobit and Judith, the first two of the three short stories, and First, Second Maccabees. So there's four books there toward the end of the historical section. Then you got Wisdom and Sirach at the end of the wisdom literature section. There's six. There's one book among the prophetic books, and that's Baruch. Baruch is not included in Protestant Bibles, but it is in Catholic. Okay, let's talk about wisdom as a movement in the ancient world. The wisdom literature that we have in our Bibles did not grow up in a vacuum, did not spring into existence in a vacuum. Israel was one nation among many nations in the ancient Near East. This will look familiar to some of you. Here is a map of the ancient Near East. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Here you have the Nile River flowing out of the mountains of Sudan, through Ethiopia, up through Egypt, into the Delta region here, dumping into the Mediterranean. Over here you have the Sinai Peninsula hanging down into the Red Sea. That's where Moses led the Israelites over to Mount Sinai. Then you've got the Arabian Peninsula hanging down into the Arabian Sea. Here's the Persian Gulf. And here are two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, which dump down into the Persian Gulf. In ancient times, this was referred to as Mesopotamia. That's because in Greek, mesos means between or among, and patamos means river. So the land between the rivers is what Mesopotamia means. Egypt was certainly a major culture, civilization, and Mesopotamia was certainly a major civilization. In fact, the earliest civilization in the entire world arose in Mesopotamia. Originally, the inhabitants of this region were a group known as Sumerians, and they called their country Sumer. We've never been able to make any connections between Sumerian language and any other language. So we don't know who these people were. They seem to have been already in this territory by about 4000 BC. They're the ones who invented cuneiform, writing with wedges, wedge-shaped writing. Civilization arose in Sumeria probably about 3500 BC. I say that because the word civilization has as its root the Latin word civis, and civis means city. So what were the earliest cities? Well, Erech, Ur, Lakash, all of these cities right here in Sumeria, they all seem to have arisen around 3500 BC or earlier. So the very first civilization on Earth was in the Mesopotamian river valleys. It's not an accident that it was around a river valley, because the river provided extra fertile land, which permitted farming techniques to give you concentrated food supply, which allowed for a surplus of population, which allowed for the kind of density of population you need to have an urban area. The second civilization on Earth to have arisen was over here in Egypt, but it did not arise until about 3100 BC, 3100 BC, about 400 years later, perhaps under Mesopotamian influence. We don't know. Later on, you get a civilization arising around the Indus River in India. That was about 2500 BC. And then, fourthly, you have civilization arising in China around the Yangtze or Yellow River. That's about 1500 BC. So, other civilizations are later. The earliest civilizations are here in the Near East. So these civilizations have been around for a long time. By the time Moses and the Israelites and Joshua show up and conquer the land of Canaan and become their own country, that's around 1200. So the Holy Land, Israel, is kind of a dinky little country in between these two huge countries. Mesopotamia and Egypt were like the two superpowers of the ancient world, like the U.S. and USSR. And Israel was a little country in between. Well, since these other civilizations had been around for a couple thousand years, or 1,500 years, by the time Israel came into existence as a nation, it's not surprising that they had very well-developed literary traditions. And one of the things that their literature did was to create books containing what they referred to as wisdom. So there was literature that was called wisdom literature in Mesopotamia and in Egypt well before Israel was in existence. Consequently, Israelite wisdom literature partakes in a much broader, vaster literary movement that pre-existed it. And consequently, Israelite wisdom literature is influenced by the wisdom literature of Mesopotamia and of Egypt. For example, the wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, a number of writings from Mesopotamia that we would include as wisdom literature have come down to us. In large part, this is because the Mesopotamians liked to write on clay tablets. They would take some clay, form it into a square about that size, 6 by 8, 10 by 5, something like that. And then they would write on it with these little wedges. They'd have a little triangle and then a dowel rod, and they'd use the dowel to move the triangle around and make chicken tracks, it looks like, when you look at it. And then they would harden the clay tablets. Lay them out in the sun, they'll harden. Stick them in a kiln, they'll harden. And once they're hard, these things last a very long time. There was one king of Assyria. Later on, Mesopotamia broke into a couple of regions. The northern part was called Assyria, and the southern part was called Babylonia. There was one king of Assyria who lived in the 600s. His name was Ashurbanipal. And he was really into books. This guy loved to read. Of course, he read cuneiform on clay tablets. Consequently, being super rich, he amassed a huge library of Assyrian and Sumerian literature. And when he died, soon after he died, the capital of Assyria, which was Nineveh, was conquered by the Babylonians. It was burned. It turns out that Ashurbanipal's library was covered up by a bunch of rubbish and debris and ash from the conquering of Nineveh. And it wasn't until, I believe it was the 1890s, 1880s, archaeologists from Europe scrounged around where Nineveh used to be, and they discovered huge racks of clay tablets. These clay tablets were in apparently metal or wooden boxes, so you could flip from one to the next like that, almost like card catalog drawers, you know, you go along these clay tablets. And they were all right there. The wood had all rotted away, but all the tablets were still laying there in perfect rows when we discovered them. So we have a lot of ancient Mesopotamian literature from these clay tablets, and we know how to decipher cuneiform. We figured that out. And so we know what these things say. Consequently, we have good examples of wisdom literature in Mesopotamia with which we can compare the biblical writings, and we notice certain similarities. Just to give you an example, there's one work of Babylonian wisdom literature which we refer to as the Babylonian Theodicy. Theodicy is a term that's used in philosophy. It means justifying God's ways to men. It really deals with the problem of evil. And when you sit down and read this book, you discover that it's about a fella who was very, very rich when all at once terrible catastrophes befell him. He lost all of his possessions, he lost all of his children, he lost his health. And the bulk of the work is him sitting around with a couple of friends talking it over. What does this remind you of? Job, exactly. So, Job is not unique to Israel. The idea of Job pre-existed Israelite wisdom literature. To give you another example, we have lots of Egyptian wisdom literature that has come down to us. One example of Egyptian wisdom literature is a book which we call The Instruction of Ptahhotep. Ptahhotep was the name of a nobleman, I guess you would say, among the Egyptians. He lived prior to 1000 BC, and he was, you could sort of say that he was in the cabinet. You know, he was the guy who was in charge of waterworks, which were very important, since you only have the Nile to keep everybody fed. So he wasn't the president, the pharaoh, he wasn't the vice pharaoh, but he was pretty high up there, you know, kind of like Secretary of the Interior or something like that. Well, he sat down and wrote a book, and he wrote it to his son. It's a collection of, here's what I have learned throughout my life. Here is my advice to you as you mature and enter your adult years. I want you to memorize these sayings, and they will stand you in good stead. Well, when we get to the book of Proverbs, 2 or 3 sessions from now, we will discover and we will see that some of these sayings in Ptahhotep are also in the book of Proverbs. And Ptahhotep has exactly 30 sayings, and this section of the book of Proverbs has a lot of these sayings. They're all in the same section, and they're even introduced as 30 sayings of wisdom. And they're in the same order. So obviously there's some kind of literary relationship among these two. So my point is that we shouldn't think of the wisdom literature as being unique to Israel. Wisdom literature was an international movement among the literati, people who knew how to read and write. You can think of it similarly to an international literary movement more recently, like maybe Romanticism. You know, Romanticism got going around 1800. It shows up certainly in England. Who were the big romantic poets in England? Shelley, Keats, Rossetti, what's her name? Christina Rossetti is who I'm thinking of. Christina, okay. Byron, Keats, sure, all of these women. Now those are British, but there's also romantic poets among the Germans. Wolfgang Goethe was a romantic poet, probably more famous on the continent than any of the English ones. Schiller was a romantic poet among the Germans. The French, I'm sure, had romantic poets, although I can't think of any more. Take my word for it, yeah. Okay, so you get the idea. Just like there's international movements in literature nowadays, or existentialism, early 20th century, kind of an international movement of writings, Sartre's novels, Camus' novels, etc. So there was this international movement among all of the Near Eastern countries, and Israel partook in it. There's even references in the Bible to the wisdom of Edom. You've heard of Edom? It's a really good cheese. But that's not what we mean. Israel, the Holy Land, let me blow that up over here, was surrounded by 6 other countries, smaller than it. One of them was Phoenicia. One of them was Aram. One of them was Ammon. One of them was Moab. One of them was Edom. And one of them was Philistia, where the Philistines lived. Remember Samson killed a bunch of Philistines? So Edom was this country down here. Herod the Great, interestingly enough, was from Edom. The Romans imposed him upon the Jews. That's one reason the Jews hated him at the time of Jesus. Well, there's references in the Bible to the wisdom of the Edomites, so that even a little country like Edom must have had a few guys who could read and write and who partook in this international movement. Well, this raises the question of literacy in these ancient times. How widespread was literacy back in the Old Testament times? Well, it probably grew over the centuries, so we can't make a blanket statement. But the guess is that it probably was not very widespread. Literacy was seen as a skill. It was not something that everybody knew and took for granted like we do nowadays. If you learned how to read and write, then you did that instead of learning how to be a carpenter, or instead of learning how to make jewelry, or instead of learning how to be a stonemason. It was simply one more trade among all the other trades. And it was a way of ensuring that you had an income. Because, I have no idea what the actual percentages are, but let's say, here we are in David's time, 1000 BC. Let's say that 90% of the population doesn't know how to read and write, including David. That means if you know how to read and write, you're going to make a good income. Because everybody wants to write a letter once in a while. You get to be their scribe. And so, the scribes are probably the ones who learned from these other civilizations how to go about writing wisdom-type literature. Now let's do a little chronological framework here. We know that Moses probably died about 1220. When he died, the Israelites, whom he had led to Mount Sinai, and from Mount Sinai up to the eastern border of the Holy Land, right there on the bank of the Jordan River. He died in 1220. Joshua took over, and Joshua is the one who crossed the Jordan River with the Israelite army and conquered the whole country. The country prior to them was called Canaan, inhabited by Canaanites. Now, for the next 200 years, each of the 12 tribes lived in its own separate territory. The Holy Land was divided up by the Israelites right after they conquered it into each tribal unit. So here you have the tribe of Issachar, here you had Zebulun, here you had Gad, here you have Naphtali, Here you had Reuben, Simeon, Benjamin, Joseph, etc. It was all divided up into territories, including the tribe of Judah, from whence David ruled emerged. So this is around 1220 that we start with these tribal territories. You should not think of them as a United States. They were not a single country. They were 12 separate little countries. Now, occasionally, they would get attacked by these other countries that were around them. Phoenicia, Aram, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. The Philistines might decide to attack Judah. Whenever they would attack Judah, the Judahites would send messengers to the other tribes and say, oh, we're being attacked again. And then the other tribes would send young men of soldierly age. The Israelites would form an ad hoc army. They would appoint someone who was kind of a charismatic military leader to lead the army, and then the Israelites would repel whomever was trying to attack them. Later on, the Edomites might attack Simeon. Later on, the Ammonites might attack Gad, whatever. This happened over and over again. You can read about these attacks in the book of Judges. Because this is the period of the Judges, when these charismatic military leaders, these ad hoc generals who were put in charge of the army during the defense of the tribes, afterward would continue to hold the office of judge. So if there was a dispute within a tribe that they couldn't settle, they'd send them to the guy that we had as a general last time we had a war. And he would serve as the judge, making a decision. So we refer to these guys as judges, but their principal function was to be a charismatic military leader during a time of crisis. There's 12 judges in the book of Judges. You can read about them. One of them, the most famous, is Samson. He's one of the 12 judges. Others are Deborah, Barak, and Gideon, and so on. Well, during this period of a couple of hundred years that the Israelites were judges, they were not wealthy. They're basically just little groups of dirt farmers, herders. It was not until they finally wised up and said, you know what, I'll bet if we all became a single country, they wouldn't keep picking on us anymore. And sure enough, that's what they did. They decided to become a monarchy. Let us unite into a single country with a single king, just like all these other countries have single kings, and I'll bet you we can keep their defense. That's exactly what they did. The period of the Judges began in 1220. It ended right around 1020, when the Israelites wound up with their very first king. Who was the first king of Israel? Saul. Saul was appointed the first king. He was king for approximately 20 years. He was an okay king, but he still had the kind of primitive tribal mentality, besides which he went crazy in his last couple of years, so that didn't help. The greatest king that the Israelites ever had came right after Saul. It's very convenient that he took the throne in 1000 BC, because that's easy to remember. David became king in 1000 BC. And David was an excellent military general. He took this newly formed national army of the Israelites, and instead of using it purely for defensive purposes, he actually went out and attacked each of these other countries in turn. So that, by the time his reign ended, all of these outside countries, Phoenicia, Aram, Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, had become vassal kingdoms. They had become tribute payers to the Israelites. They paid their tribute right here to the capital of the Israelites, which was Jerusalem. David took a relatively small village called Salem up in the mountains of his tribal territory, Judah, and made it into the capital of the whole as a result of his conquests, tribute, wealth, starts pouring into Jerusalem from all these other countries. David then dies. And who takes over, of course? Solomon. So Solomon inherits a situation where he doesn't have to go out and fight. He doesn't have to be a great military thinker because his dad did all that. And we've already conquered all of these other countries. What he inherits is big piles of gold all over the place. He inherits a very wealthy country. Consequently, he can recline back and enjoy the fruits of these labors. He can sponsor the arts. And that's exactly what he does. There is a burst of literary activity that occurred under Solomon. The period of Solomon's reign is a time of great artistic endeavor, high culture among the Israelites. Now add to this the fact that Solomon had as one of his chief wives, no, take that back. Solomon had as his chief wife, he had 1,000 wives. What the Bible says. That's why he died. He had 1,000 wives, but his chief wife was an Egyptian princess. His father-in-law was the Pharaoh. Is it any wonder then that in this explosion of literary activity under Solomon, he would have sent scribes over to Egypt, or they would have gone with him when he went over there to visit dad-in-law, and they would learn from the scribes in Egypt. Scribes who had inherited a 1,000-year-long literary tradition of wisdom literature. So these Israelite scribes, there would not have been that many of them. This is a relatively new country still, although it's got these pretensions to high culture. They would have learned how to write wisdom literature, and they would have brought that back with them to the court in Jerusalem. Consequently, Solomon gains a reputation for wisdom as a result of his burgeoning literary activity during his reign. Now, I don't mean to suggest that he wasn't a wise guy. He may very well have been a very wise person. You remember that interesting story in 1 Kings chapter 3, where the two women bring the baby. Do you remember that story? What are the details on that? They both claim to be the mother, and his solution to it was, cut the baby in half, give half to each. One of the mothers said, okay, that's fair. And the other one said, no. And then, of course, Solomon gives the baby to the one who is willing to sacrifice her portion of the baby to the other mother rather than have the baby killed. That's pretty wise, right? Pretty clever. Plus, there's a very interesting description of Solomon's wisdom. It occurs in 1 Kings chapter 4. See if I can find it here. Oh, I thought it was in 4. Let me check. Yeah, 429. Well, they transferred 429 somewhere else in the Bible. Here it is. They put it at the end of 5. The Muslim Bible has a tendency to do that sometimes. They think that there has been some kind of disruption in the transmission of the text of the Bible, so they try to fix it. Anyway, here's what it says. Yahweh gave Solomon immense wisdom and understanding, and a heart as vast as the sand on the seashore. The wisdom of Solomon surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east, Mesopotamia, and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman and Calcol and Darda. They can't, whoa, he must have been very wise. We have no idea who these guys were, but they must have been wise. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his psalms numbered 1,005. He could talk about plants, from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop growing on the wall. And he could talk of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. Men from all nations came to hear Solomon's wisdom, and he received gifts from all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So, unquestionably, Solomon has a reputation for wisdom. The thing is, we don't know to what extent this description of Solomon's wisdom, which is from the Deuteronomistic history. When was the Deuteronomistic history written? 550. We don't know to what extent that reflects actual wisdom on Solomon's part, or whether wisdom was attributed to Solomon because he was the patron. He was the king during this period of very great literary activity. But in a way, it doesn't really matter. The point is, there was a burgeoning of wisdom under Solomon's reign. Solomon reigned the second half of the 900s. You see. It's because Solomon wound up with this reputation for wisdom that later works in the wisdom tradition wind up being attributed to him, even though they cannot possibly have been him. For example, among the wisdom literature books, we had Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Koheleth, Song of Songs, Wisdom, Sirach. Job is not attributed to Solomon. Psalms is not attributed to Solomon. In fact, who are the Psalms attributed? David. Why are they attributed to David? In his youth, he was a lyre player for King Saul. So, he got the reputation for being someone who created psalms. Proverbs, however, does attribute a large number of them to Solomon. So here is one book where the bulk of the book is attributed to Solomon. Koheleth begins by saying, the words of Koheleth, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Who was son of David, king of Jerusalem? Solomon. Consequently, this book attributes itself to Solomon. Song of Songs is also known as Song of Solomon, so that one attributes itself to Solomon. Book of Wisdom is also known as Wisdom of Solomon. That one attributes itself to Solomon, and Sirach does not. So, out of 7 books, 4 have some kind of explicit attribution to Solomon. Now, we don't think that all of these books were written by Solomon. We have good reasons for believing that. Just to give you one quick example, the book of Koheleth has in it a reference to an orchard. And the Hebrew word that's used there for orchard is a word that the Hebrews learned from the Persians. They learned this word from the Persians and they imported it into their language, and that became the word for orchard. We do that all the time, right, in English? The word Davenport is an Arabic word. During the Middle Ages, the Crusaders came in contact with the Muslims. They learned about Davenports, and therefore they borrowed that word and it wound up in English later on. Give me another borrow. Give me a word that we borrowed from the French. Chauffeur. That will work. How about Native Americans? Tobacco. I mean, we borrow these loan words all the time. Well,
Bayou comes from native language also.
Native American?
Yes, Ayuko was the original Native American.
Oh, that's interesting.
So there's a name that's used in the world is banquet. In sidewalk. Yeah, and
Banquet, like the bread, huh?
Like banquet.
Backhead, yeah, you're right, backhead. Oh, that's interesting. A little bank, right? Yeah, that's cool. The problem is that the Hebrews did not come in contact with the Persians until 539, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians and all of the Babylonians' territories, one of which at that time was Israel. So that loan word must have come from after 539. If Koheleth is using words that enter the Hebrew language after 539, it cannot have been written by Solomon back in the 900s, etc. I mean, it's one tiny proof. There's lots of these proofs. So we have good reason for believing that these works are not by Solomon as a simplification. Nevertheless, it could be that some of those proverbs attributed to Solomon may actually go back to him. Who knows? That's a possibility that we have to leave open. We can't say one way for sure, one way or the other. I'd like to finish off by making a reference to some literary forms that you tend to find in wisdom literature that you don't normally find in the other two big sections of the Old Testament, the historical books and the prophetic books. One of these is the proverb. We do occasionally get a proverb in the historical books. For example, there's one spot where somebody says, like mother, like daughter. That's a proverb. That occurs over in one of the narratives in Deuteronomy or something, I don't remember. But for the most part, proverbs appear in the wisdom literature book. Well, a proverb is typically a couplet, 2 lines, which form a nugget, a juicy nugget of wisdom. Another literary form that you find occasionally in the Old Testament and that you would expect to find in the wisdom literature, but really don't, is the parable. Now, we think of parables, we think of Jesus, right? Jesus told lots of parables: prodigal son, good Samaritan, lost coin, all these things. And Jesus does incorporate a lot of characteristics of the wisdom literature in his sayings. Maybe we can look at that the last night of our series, if we've got time. It's interesting to look at Jesus in terms of wisdom literature. So you would think that there would be parables in the wisdom literature. Actually, there are very few parables in the Old Testament. And those that do occur tend to occur not in the wisdom literature, but in the historical books. Let me give you an example of a parable. This is from 2 Samuel, chapter 12. David has been a naughty boy. He has slept with another man's wife, named Bathsheba, and he has had the man murdered afterward in order to cover up the fact. So, Yahweh sent Nathan the prophet to David. This is 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1. And Nathan the prophet came to him and said, in one town there were 2 men. One was rich, the other was poor. The rich man had flocks and herds in great abundance. The poor man had nothing but a single lamb, one only, a small one that he had bought. This he fed, and it grew up with him and his children, eating his bread, drinking from his cup, sleeping on his breast. It was like a daughter to him. When there came a traveler to stay, the rich man refused to take one of his own flock or herd to provide for the wayfarer who had come to him. Instead, he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guest. David's anger flared up against the man. As Yahweh lives, David said, this man deserves to die. Nathan then pointed at him and said, you are they. Cool, huh? Now that's a parable, isn't line is the riddle. The people who wrote the wisdom books were fond of riddles. We're going to look at some riddles in the book of Proverbs for the evening that we do the book of Proverbs. I don't mean to suggest that riddles are not found outside the wisdom literature section of the Old Testament, but they're rare. There is one I can think of that concerns Samson. Do you remember that time that Samson was meeting with some buddies and they asked him for a riddle, and he said, out of the strong came something sweet. Out of the strong came something to eat. Something like that. But that's all it was. So they scratched their heads for 3 or 4 days and came back and said, we have no idea what you're talking about. Well, it turned out that on his way to meet his buddies, he had passed a lion that had recently died and a group of bees. What do you call bees? They're not a flock. They're not a herd. Hive. Yes, a hive of bees had come and opened up the belly and had formed honeycomb on the innards of the lion. So this was his, I don't think that's very fair. Who's going to think of that, right? But that was his riddle. So there are riddles outside the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, but they're rare. They're not all that frequent in the wisdom literature, but we've got 20 maybe that occur in the wisdom literature, far more than elsewhere. Lastly, concerning literary form, we should point out 2 characteristics of the wisdom literature. And these are really characteristics of not just the wisdom literature, but of Hebrew poetry. Wherever you've got Hebrew poetry, you almost always have parallelism. Parallelism means saying the same basic thing twice. That's the idea. Let's take an example of parallelism. I'm just going to shut my eyes here and crack open the Bible. Plop my hand down. Now here I am at Job 22. Here's what it says. Does God derive any benefit from your integrity? Does he profit from your blameless conduct? Now there's 2 clauses. They form a couplet. The first one says, does God derive any benefit from your integrity? The second says, does he profit from your blameless conduct? Does the second really add anything to the first one? No, it just repeats the first one in other words. This is an instance of parallelism. There's 3 basic types of parallelism that you can find in Hebrew poetry. Often, the parallelism is synonymous. Synonymous parallelism means that the second line simply restates what the first line has said. They let their infants frisk like lambs. They let their children dance like deer. Synonymous parallelism. Sometimes, however, you'll have an instance where the second line will have a but at the beginning, and it'll say the antithesis of the first line. Here's an example. A wise son is his father's joy, but a foolish son is his mother's grief. See how the second line is the antithesis of the first one? Here's another one. Treasures wickedly come by give no benefit, but right conduct brings delivery from death. The second is the opposite of the first. They're still parallel because they're both dealing with the same subject. And in a way, the second says negatively what the first says positively, or vice versa. So it's still parallelism, but it's a different sort. This is called antithetic parallelism. Those are the 2 basic types of parallelism. In addition, there are also couplets where the two lines neither repeat nor say the opposite. The second line is simply the completion of the first line. So this is really not parallelism. We probably shouldn't call it parallelism. But because the two lines obviously go together, because they're both the same length, they form a couplet, we still include it as a type of parallelism. We simply call it synthetic parallelism, because we synthesize the second half with the first half to arrive at a complete thought. They really shouldn't be called parallelism, but because they are metrically parallel, because they have the same metering mode, and the two form a single sentence, what the heck? We have that as kind of a grab bag category to throw all the others into that don't fit as either synonymous or antonyms.